I will talk about strange authorization requirements today and how to solve them. There are two different difficult words. The one is authentication, the other is authorization. I will only talk about the latter today. Authentication is about signing in, signing out. Authorization is about permission rules, so who is allowed to do what. And I will talk about authorization today. There is a reason why I think I can tell you something about this. I'm working for Makandra, and we are a Rails development shop, and we do a lot of Rails projects. So basically we do a new greenfield Rails project every 2 months, and we have a lot of different clients. And so we have seen many weird authorization requirements in the wild. And the one thing that we realize is that when it comes to permission rules, there is basically no limit to what people will come up with. For example, something like this. So we have managers and we have bookings, and managers should be able to edit bookings. And then you ask, okay, can you tell me more? And then they, yeah, but only those bookings from their subordinates. And also, we can't have people edit booking that are too old, because that already went through bookkeeping and stuff. So we have to limit this. Only the last 2 days maybe edited. And we also wanted to only work on workdays, because we can't have people come in the weekend and change everything. And also managers have contracts and they expire, and they should only be allowed to edit stuff while they have an active contract. And but sometimes they're acting as a proxy for the colleague, and then they should be able to edit their bookings too. Basically, something like this is going on in every project I've ever worked on. And the larger the organization that you work for, the more likely you get stuff like this, because then it's all about who is allowed to do what, who can be blamed for what, and so on. So what do we need to do? What do we need to do to implement stuff like this? And the first thing we realized is we need something that is very expressive. There's a talk about Seth Shaw that's called "The ACL is Dead," who said that we need Turing-complete authorization descriptions because people are coming up with stuff that is too complicated to just fill into a matrix where it says, okay, manager, edit, check, or may destroy, not check. We need something that is very expressive, so basically we need Ruby. We need something that is just a programming language. The second thing we realized is that authorization is a cross-cutting concern. It affects every part of your application, and it always tends to infect the whole application. So you have crazy requirements, and suddenly all your code is crazy as well, because everything has to somehow play their part in implementing the requirements. And the last thing is we need a solution that somehow works with large amounts of data, because if we have something that works with a few records, it's not any good if I have many thousand bookings for many thousand users. So before I show you how we do it, I want to tell you how you should not do it, but how we have done in the past. So there are two anti-patterns that I want to show you. The one is to do authorization in the model. Who is not working with Rails, who has never worked with Rails before? In this room, please. Okay.
Stand up and get off.
Okay. because I will explain it. If something is not clear, feel free to speak up and I will explain it. So basically, what this piece of code says, we have a post and it's associated with an author, and we want to make sure that only admins may be authors of a post. So in this code example, the programmer did a validation that checks before the record is committed to the database. She checks if the author is actually an admin. And don't do this. Don't do authorization logic in the model, because the first thing, you spread your authorization requirements through all the models. So if something changes, you need to go to all your code and make sure they, in their emergent collective behavior, reflect the new requirements. Your model should not only work in the context of a controller request. It should also work for batch processing, for background tasks. When you monkey around the console, they should still work. And when you are on the console, you don't want your application to tell you that you cannot update your own records. Or when you write another model method, you should be able to freely edit other models without authorization being in the way. The other anti-pattern is to just do authorization everywhere, not just in the model, just everywhere. Something like this I've seen in many projects that we have started to maintain from other people, where just pieces of authorization logic is just spread everywhere in the applications, like mold. It's ugly and it's everywhere. So for example, this is a update method of a controller, and what we see is, okay, there's a lot of going on. So the first unless user.supervise, okay, obviously the controller wants to make sure that the post that is the user that is being updated is actually allowed to be updated by the current user. All right, and then there's also another check that somehow checks that a value that will be assigned is allowed. And again, if you do it like this, your authorization logic is spread everywhere. And whenever you change anything, you need to go through all your code and make sure that its collective behavior works. It's also crazy to test because you need to write a test for every piece of code where you spread your authorization logic. So something that has worked for us for quite a while is we came up with a set of rules how to keep the crazy contained. So whenever we get authorization requirements, we do those 4 things. We reduce the requirements so they just are expressed in sets of things that the user is allowed to do. Then we move all those sets of things that the user is allowed to do into a set of repository, like a class that is globally accessible. Then we write the applications so they query this repository for those sets. And lastly, we make sure that authorization is just not performed when we are not in the context of a current user of a request of controller. And I will show you how this is, how we apply these rules. And I will use 2 tools for this. These are console and assignable values. Basically, those tools are not very special. It's just the way that I like to do it, or we like to do it. But everything we talk about here, you can do with other authorization jams. You can do it in plain Ruby. You can do it in any language of your choice. Yeah, the other thing that we noticed is that as crazy as those requirements are, they can always be reduced to the following 8 building blocks. So basically, whenever someone comes up with a requirement, like the one I showed you, you can reduce it to something like this, a combination of those. I will just go through each of those and show you how we implement them. Okay, this is the most basic requirement that you will encounter. It's just you have some resource like post, and you want to restrict what the current user is allowed to see. For example, a user may only see her own posts. So what we do is we take these requirements and reduce it to a set of accessible things. And when we're talking about posts, a great way to express a subset of what is accessible is to use scopes. So who does not know what scopes are in Active Record? Everyone? Okay. So scopes just like a description of a query that you are planning to run sometime in the future. So in this example, we said a user may only see your own post. We say post.where author ID is user ID. So this is a way to express this in Active Record. So then we take this scope that you see in the 3rd last line there, and we put it into a place where that's accessible to the whole application. In the world of console, which is a tool I'm using for this, we call this power. This is the central repository that contains all the description of things you are allowed to access. And we just do this power post2, post where author ID, user ID. And now we have central place that we can query. Okay, I'll show you how. Current power, it's a singleton, and we can say, okay, give me all the posts that the current user is allowed to access. Or I can ask the variant with a question mark at the end. I can ask, hey, is the user allowed to access any post at all? Or I can ask, okay, is the user allowed to access this post that I'm giving you? So I will show you how to integrate this with your application. So basically, this is a very simple controller that shows posts, and we have just a show action and an init action. And I guess that if you would write a controller right now, you would write it something like this. So for the show action, you need to find the object in the database, and for the init action, you need to load a whole collection of stuff from the database. And a good practice is to use the scope or the model name that is used to load records or load a collection of records in a method, which I call end of association chain, but you can call it differently. And as you see, in the end, we just pointed to the post power that we stored in power.current. So, and the nice thing about scopes is you can't escape them. So if you are looking for a post with the ID 15 in a scope, and the scope already excludes that post, you cannot find it. It's like as if it wasn't there. And this is a very nice way to like restrict what the controller is able to see. Actually, we like to use some sort of controller abstraction. Not everyone likes them, but we like them. It's basically a gem like inherited resources or resource controller that dynamically generates controller implementation for you, which just gives you the 7 default actions like index, show, edit, update, destroy, and so on, and it implements them sort of like you would implement them yourself, so you don't have to write the same code ever again. And so we only override what we don't like. Has anyone a question what this resource controller thing does? Okay, I'm just using it because we'll make the following examples a lot shorter, so we can focus on what is important. And also because this pattern that we override the end of the authorization chain with, that we point it to something in our power is so common that we also have a shortcut for this, so we just say this, but it's the same as writing it by hand. Okay, so we move on to the next building block that is, okay, we have one resource, but there are different ways of working with that resource, like reading, updating, destroying, and we have different permissions attached to that. For example, a user may see all the posts, but of those posts, she may edit those posts that aren't published yet. So again, we go back to our rules and reduce it to requirements. We reduce the requirement to set of accessible things, and now we have two powers. We have the post power above, and we have a second power that's updatable post that just changes the scope with another condition. So it says, okay, take all the scopes that the user is allowed to see, and then also make another condition that says only those that are not published. And the great thing about scopes, you can change them. You can just add condition after condition after condition, and when you run the query, they're just ended. So it's like the which is not union, it's the Schnittmenge, intersection of all the conditions that you have. Thank you. So how do we map this to a controller? Okay, now we have to make sure that our end of association chain is mapped to the right power for the right action that is being run. So if I'm in edit or if I'm in update, I need to use updatable posts, and otherwise I need to use posts from the previous example. And because this piece of code is sort of ugly, because we write it a lot, there's also this shortcut for this where you just say power card posts and we map it to end of association chain. So roles, that's always roles. You gotta have roles, right? So if you do enterprise stuff, you need to have roles. So it not only depends on the person that is looking at your page, it also depends on what the title or the role of that person is. Is she a manager, is she a typist, is she a developer? And again, we just reduce it to the requirements to set up accessible things, and basically we just implement roles as a case statement. So if you look at the power post, you see that it does a case statement on role, and it just returns different scopes for each role. For example, for an admin, I just get the whole post model, which is basically everything. And for authors, I return a scope on all the posts where the author is the current user. And for guest, I return something else entirely. And note how the concept of a role is not in any way built into this gem. It has no concept of a role, just Ruby. And here's the first time where we see that it's beneficial that we can just express our rules in Ruby. And we don't have an ACL that just says, okay, manager, bookings check, developer, users check, or not check. This is way more expressive. Okay, and if we go about integrating these new role-based permissions into our controller, we see that we don't have to change a thing. And this is a great thing, because the only thing that the controller knows is somewhere there are sets of accessible things, and I need to scope myself onto this, but the controller doesn't care how these sets of things came to be. If there's roles or not roles, the controller doesn't care. And this is really the point where you don't infect your whole application with the craziness. So you just have this one place, and everything that's created is in this place, and the rest of the application works with this single assumption that there is a power, and I can ask it what is accessible or not. Okay, sensitive attributes. So the idea is that there are some attributes that are holier than other attributes. For example, an author may edit a post, but posts also have this workflow state attribute, which only admins are allowed to change. So again, we do rule number one and reduce it to a set of accessible things. And for the first time, the set of accessible things is not a scope or a collection of models. this time it's just a list of attribute names. So I add another power that's called assignable post fields, and I do a case statement on role, and if it's admin, I return subject, body, and state, and if it's author, I only return subject and body. So now I have to do some work to integrate this into my application, and I wrote a small update method just so we see what's going on. So basically, the first line of update, we obtain our model, we find it in the database, then we update its attributes, and we update it with the results of this object parameters method. And what we do in the object parameters method, we don't just give all the post params, but we slice the post params. And slice it's a active support method on hash, where you can just give a number of hash keys that are allowed, and the expression returns a subhash that only has the keys that you mentioned. And we slice it to exactly those keys that we have in our power. Yeah, I know that we are not using Rails master assignment protection. So Rails has this thing called utter accessible and utter protected, and I don't really like it. I think it's a little too naive because it assumes that every controller, so every context that you use the model with, needs the same kind of protection, which is not true. It also is a little too stupid because you just give it a static list of attribute names. And again, I don't want the behavior of my model to be changed in any other context but the request controller user context. So if I am in the console, if I am in a rake task, and so on, I don't want any sort of authorization related behavior change in my models. I just want the full power. So we don't like to use this from Rails, but maybe you like, it's up to you. There's also this requirement to restrict attribute values, and this is a little different from restricting what attributes may be changed. So this is saying, if I'm allowed to change this attribute, what are the values that I am allowed to set into this attribute? For example, an author may change the state of a post, though an author may also change the workflow state, but only admins may set the state published. So basically only admins may publish stuff. And again, we use rule number 1, we reduce it to require to set of accessible things, and this time the set of accessible things is a list of values that are allowed. And well, we could use a validation for this. There's validation inclusion off in Rails, but it has some drawbacks. The first thing is it's too stupid. Again, we can only give it a static list of values, and this is not expressive enough for our use case. Also, again, I don't want any kind of authorization logic in my model. So we use this gem that's called assignable values that is sort of the same. It's like a little more awesome. It does sort of the same like the validation, but it generates the list of what is allowed at runtime. So it has block like assignable values for state do, and everything between the do and end is just evaluated at runtime, so I can just write Ruby into it. So the values that I return can be dynamic. But I don't want it in the model, so I'll move it into my power again. So I can tell the assignable values gem that the list of what is accessible is just somewhere else. I can point it to my power by using this through option. And yeah, because we write this a lot, there's also this shortcut that we like to use, but it's the same. Then in my power, I have this method that is called assignable post states, and I just put all my authorization logic in there. So I make a case statement role and make sure the method returns the right things for the right roles. So how does this work now? Basically, like the validates inclusion of, the authorization rule is now manifest as a validation in the post model. So in the first line, I instantiate a new post with the workflow state published, and now I'll like look at it with different kinds of user, and I ask the post, are you valid or not? So in the first triple of lines, I look at it from the point of view of an admin, and I can ask the post, okay, what are your assignable states? And it will return draft, delivered, and published because I'm an admin. And this is also very useful if you like populate select boxes or something in a web form. And I can ask the post, are you valid? And the post says, yeah, I'm valid, sure. Because an admin is editing me. And then in the last triple of lines, I look at it from the point of an author. I ask the post, what are your assignable states? And it just says draft and delivered. And the published state is missing. And we had this fourth rule that says, okay, we don't want any authorization when there is not a controller context, when there's not a request, and there's not a user at the other end. for example, on the console. So, and in the last one line, I set the current power to nil, meaning that there is no controller context, and the post is valid because the validation is simply skipped. And this is exactly what I want. I want authorization to only be active when there is a user at the other side. So again, in our controller, we didn't have to change a thing because the controller has been validating before and it's validating now, so we're fine. And also, if I'm trying to set a field to a value that I'm not allowed, I will get the usual race error handling where the field is red and it says blah blah blah, it's not allowed and so on. Yeah, restricting what may be associated. It's sort of similar to what we had with the values that are allowed, but now we're not talking about like flat attributes with the model, we're talking about things that are associated with the model that we're looking at. So for example, users with logged accounts may not be assigned as post authors. So what does this mean? Essentially, it's the same as restricting a scalar attribute like a string or integer, except that we're now dealing with scopes and with foreign keys instead of like flat values. And the nice thing about this assignable values gem, it gives you the same syntax for both cases. So even though under the hood it works sort of differently because you have to compare foreign keys instead of value identities, it just looks the same. You just say authorized values for author, and author is a belongs to association, and in the power it also looks the same. I'm just returning a collection of users or a scope of users, and will just work as expected. Something that we need to deal with is that values that were once authorized can change with time. So what was valid yesterday may not be valid tomorrow. An example, we have a user and she has 1,000 posts in our database, and now we lock her account. And we had this rule where we said locked users cannot be post authors. Now I suddenly have 1,000 invalid posts in my database, and I cannot have this. I cannot ever have a single invalid post in my database. And this happens all the time. This is not an edge case. This happens all the time. And a very simple solution is to only validate when a value changes. So if a value was ever authorized, it will be authorized the next time until it is changed. Okay, and this is the last building block that I'm going to talk about. This is authorized values that depend on the value of other fields. So for example, a user may change the state of all posts, but only published posts by subordinates. So, okay, there's a lot of going on. And again, we can just break it down to sets of accessible things. So if we look at this power assignable post states, I must make sure that I will allow the value of published only when the author is a subordinate of the user that is looking at my page. So my power can just take an argument, that's post, that's what the thing behind the do. And now I can check, is my current user the supervisor of the post author? And if yes, then allow this published state, and otherwise I don't allow it. And again, I didn't have to change the controller or something, it just is part of the generated validation. Okay, so we took a look at these 8 things. So we took a look how we can restrict access to a resource. We have seen what can be done if there's just one resource, but there are different contexts, how I want to work with that. We took a look at roles and sensitive attributes. We talked about restricting values that are only some values are allowed. The same thing for association, and the last thing was authorizing values that depend on other fields. So we've been doing this for like 2 years in this style, and for the first time we're really happy with it. And I'm only saying this because we have been really unhappy with how we did it before. But this is the first time that it just feels right. So it's no longer scary when people come at us with like strange wishes how they want to restrict what people may do or not do.